Good morning. Welcome to the Alberta Field Pea Environmental Product Declaration webinar. My name is Dean Dick at the Ag Info Center. I am helping to organize this webinar. A few housekeeping items right off the top. If you're having problems with audio and you're going on by the phone, just a reminder to hit the audio pin. That will let you in and be able to listen to the webinar. The second is how to ask a question. On your control panel, there is a question box. You can type in a question for the presenter. That will go on to the organizers, and we will read them out for the presenter to answer probably at the end of the presentation. The second is if you would like to ask a verbal question, you may see a hand on your control panel. Just click on that to raise your hand. The organizer will unmute you, and then you can ask a verbal question. So there's a couple of options. Right now, I will pass it over to Karen Yakimishin, who will do the introduction of our speaker.
Thanks, Dean. Welcome to everybody today to today's sustainability webinar. This series was developed by the Environmental Stewardship Branch, and it was developed in order to increase our knowledge and understanding of the different agricultural industries' sustainability initiatives. So it will be recorded and will be posted on our department's sustainability series webpage. So moving forward here today, Nevin Rosaasen from Alberta Pulse Growers will be sharing with us their journey on how they obtained the Environmental Production Declaration for Alberta Field Peas. So on to Nevin, it's all yours, thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Karen. I just wanted to double check my audio before I kick it off. Dean, can you guys hear me loud and clear?
Yes, you're good. Proceed.
Great, thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction. And again, good morning to everybody who's attending today. And I'm very happy to be speaking through your screen and coming into your home or your office today. So I invite you to join me on this journey about looking at the Alberta Field Pea Environmental Product Declaration. So I have a series of slides here for the presentation that I'm going to give, and we're going to make our way through them. And I'm guessing it'll take us about 25 to 35 minutes to get through some of the information that I'm going to present. So again, my name is Nevin Rosaasen. I'm the Policy and Program Specialist here at Alberta Pulse Growers. And for those of you who don't know, Alberta Pulse Growers is a farmer-directed commission that operates under Marketing Council. And we collect a check-off, a levy, that we in turn turn around and invest in research, agronomy, extension, communications, and other services, including advocacy for our members. So I cover agronomy as well as policy and grower relation issues for our growers and members across Alberta. So today we're talking about an environmental product declaration. So I'm going to try to ask a few questions up front that I know people are itching to know about, but what is an environmental product declaration to begin with? So environmental product declarations, I suppose, are a way to present relevant and verified environmental information about goods and services from specifically an environmental perspective, but through a life cycle lens. And what it allows us to do is to compare, I guess, different goods and services in regards to their relative impact on the environment. So many companies do make claims of their products' environmental superiority, etc. But these claims, they need to be made in a credible and a truthful manner. And if a company has gone through and developed an environmental product declaration, or an EPD, more of a comprehensive basis for marketing and comparing goods. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this and what the process is, etc. So I'm going to go through these slides, and again, we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. And so the first step to establishing an EPD is the step that is the most, I guess, difficult to complete, and that's a life cycle impact assessment. So what does a life cycle impact assessment do? Well, it basically looks at certain categories. Global warming potential, and that's either represented in tons of CO2 equivalent or kilograms of CO2 equivalent. In the case of the sample size we're looking at for peas, we're using kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Eutrophication, again, relates to into lakes that can cause algal blooms, etc., and are very detrimental to wetlands and waterways. Acidification relates to soils and different pH levels. And photochemical oxidation, for those of you who aren't aware of what this is the summer smog that you may see high up in the atmosphere on those hot days. So these are the 4 areas that life cycle impact assessment, at least the methodology that we're using, and we can get into that in a little bit here, but those are the impact assessment categories. Now, there's one other thing that before you start on the journey of building an environmental product declaration is different products have different types of project category rules. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on this later, but basically it's really tough to compare an Alberta field pea to a drywall or to a pair of blue jeans. They lay in totally different categories. So the rules around how to engage and how to build your EPD, your environmental product declaration, relates back to these product category rules. And again, they're different product categories behind each environmental product declaration. They basically lay out how information should be collected and how you'll carry out calculations. So step 1 is the LCA, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Step 2 is after you've completed your LCA, your life cycle analysis or assessment, you need to submit this along with the other information that's required according to those product category rules. You send it out in what would be the, I guess, template for an EPD format. It goes to a third party who is, I guess, certified in this regard to basically do a verification that the calculations are correct, that the survey was conducted, the questions that were asked were appropriate, etc. And afterwards, having received that third party verification, you would then register and publish the EPD with EnvironDeck or environdeck.com. And that is where these EPDs reside. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. And if you were to head to the website right now, if you bring up all the food and beverage categories, you can see that Alberta peas, well, we've got A in the name. So it does show up as the 4th food and beverage under fruits, vegetables, and juice, rather than showing up under grains for milling. So this is one area where, we may have to follow up and see if we can move our Alberta field peas out of the fruits, vegetable, and juice category and into perhaps the grain milling. However, you will see there are some other categories there. And if you were to look at all food and beverage categories, there are currently 143 different food and beverages that are listed in this database or on this website that have gone through this. So there are quite a few. The interesting thing is for North American food products, Alberta Pulse Growers, through collaboration that we'll talk about in a little bit with Alberta Ag and Forestry, we now have the first North American environmental product declaration. So I'm going to get into this a little bit more now about life cycle analysis. Well, one other thing, I'll just jump back again, 143 products to date, and that list keeps growing every day. So what is a life cycle analysis? It's basically a cradle to grave assessment or a really intense case study all about one product and everything related to how to build that product, grow that product, or even everything related to the supply chain if you're going as far as certain products that you saw on the previous slide. The first life cycle assessment was done in 1969, believe it or not, by Coca-Cola, and they were looking at the environmental impact of their packaging. This initial LCA resulted in Coca-Cola in switching their packaging from glass to plastic because of the less deleterious or detrimental effects, impact, footprint, etc. that it has on the environment. And basically, these LCAs allow you to compare materials and processes and the relative energy and the resulting, I guess, impact, pollution in those 4 categories on the environment. So food and ag products, it's increasingly important for companies and their marketing plans, but also consumers are interested to know what their relative impact is in regards to their food choices on the environment. So the next most recent, or I guess earliest food products were margarine, where a full LCA was completed by Unilever of all companies, a big buyer of food products centered in Europe. And they are looking at the life cycle analysis of margarine. Ice cream followed suit in 1991. And since then, the number of LCAs for food products have been growing and growing. So here you have a slide of the share of agricultural LCAs in the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessments. And you can see that the number of products continues to grow, and it won't be stopping anytime soon. So I want to just go back to the goal and why we would ever undertake such a thing like this. So we did back in 2015, sat down as staff with Alberta Pulse Growers, but also with Ag and Forestry. And we wanted to look at establishing a benchmark of our performance. And that's related to the field production of Alberta field peas. And one of the biggest reasons why this exercise is important is it allows us to identify hot spots in the life cycle stages, or focusing down in that intensive case study to see where you have the greatest environmental impact and from what inputs or what field operations, etc. And it allowed us to actually figure out exactly where our largest impacts were. It also allows us then to identify those key areas where we can seek for continual improvement in our pea production systems. So from an agronomic perspective, we now have more informed decisions in how we can make recommendations to producers. And also looking at applying LCA results to our communications. And again, this LCA resulted in the next steps, which led us down the road to an environmental product declaration. And these EPDs, we'll talk about the companies that are using them and why they can afford market differentiation and an advantage to those that go through the work and get it done. Our key audience, when we are looking at a team, is of course our pea growers here at Alberta Pulse Growers, but also Pulse Canada, our national organization, who does a lot of, whose staff do a lot of work in regards to communication with large ingredient suppliers, etc. And as well as, again, our functional unit is looking at 1 kilogram of field pea at the farm gate, and we'll get into that as we go through this along this journey. So I do want to talk about the importance of system boundaries or emission boundaries and calculations. So this does not include the LCA or the EPD, any transportation after the farm gate. So it doesn't include the shipping by truck, by train, by boat, etc., as well as how many times a consumer circles the parking lot in order to find a parking stall. That portion is outside of our emission boundaries or our system boundary. But you will see crop inputs, and this includes the transportation of crop inputs. So when we went out and surveyed our members, we actually had to do a comprehensive survey to start this. And we're going to look at some of those survey answers in a little while, but we did include the transportation. So if you're getting your inputs from the UFA, what's your relative distance, or what is the distance that those inputs have to travel? So that was included within the system boundary. And there you can see we have our crop inputs, including seed, inoculant, fertilizer, all of your pesticides and desiccants, as well as farm operations. So all of the emissions associated with those things: land preparation, rolling, harrowing, etc., and all of the different coefficients that are related to those field operations as well. And of course, with grain drying, mostly aeration fan that's used, electricity, any other fuel, if there was any drying that needed to was accounted for in the calculations. I'm going to jump to some of these results for just another small graphic, because here you can see that upstream, this includes those crop inputs and energy related to get those inputs to the farm. You can see the core, which means your field emissions and farm operations, as well as downstream storage and transportation. And this is an actual result from the EPD out of the document. And you can see we have those 4 areas of global warming potential, acidification, eutrophication, and your daytime smog. And you can see the relative share, and we have some graphs here as well coming up, some pie charts, but you can see relatively where those emissions come from. So under the core emissions of field and farm operations, you can see the global warming potential is the largest in that category. You know, whereas in other categories, they're fairly similar down here for your smog and, you know, eutrophication potential. A lot more of that comes from your crop inputs than from the actual field emissions and farm operations. So we'll keep moving on here. Here is our survey data, and I know we'll probably entertain some questions at the end on this, but we did only have 23 producers that completed the survey that were usable, and a total of almost 12,000 acres, although not all of those acres were harvested, which indeed will impact our relative performance score, or environmental product declaration, life cycle analysis, however you want to say it. The final results are going to be impacted by how these 23 producers fared across those 10.5, 11,000 acres that were harvested. So you can see here we had good representation from all of our soil zones, and of course this plays into how well we perform as well. So when we go back to kind of the aggregated results, you can see them here. The first one is our yield, and you can see that our yield across those 23 producers averaged 45 bushels per acre. You can see that our average seeding rate was around that 190 pounds, 4.7 pounds per acre would be pretty close for granular inoculant, etc. And you can also see our next category, and this is where we spent a lot of time looking at some of the analysis to figure out how that black box CIMA-Pro ISO 14025 standard works, and to actually see when we played with these numbers what happened. And this is an area where we've identified as a hotspot, as well as some of the other field operations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But as you go through, you can see guides that were used throughout the growing season. It's great for me to see this as well, because I get to take stock of what is kind of the mix of preferred crop protection products. However, you know, we do have also fungicide applications, and you can see fungicide was applied on some acres, but not all acres in all cases. So you can also see some of the other desiccants, as well as some of the pre-seed burn down products that were used in this case. So that gives you an idea of how the information was reported. And we're going to jump up here to look at these field operations. So these play an important part in the LCA as well. You can see here with harrowing that most acres got at least 1 pass, if not a few acres that had 2 passes. Rolling, not surprised it came up at 1, but not all acres were rolled as well, that you can see. Direct seeded, 11,809 acres were seeded, but down here you can see harvested at just over 10,000 acres. So we did have some crop that wasn't harvested in this survey. If those of you recall, this survey was done in 2016, which was a fairly wet year, had some challenges in certain pockets of the prairies and in Alberta as well. Herbicide application, most fields got 1 if not 2 applications, and you can see fungicide application was quite low, although some producers did have to spray twice in those who did spray. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the flavor of the field operations that contribute in those core areas for the LCA. Now here, these 4 bar graphs represent those 4 areas that the EPD is measuring in regards to your environmental impact and on the declaration. And you can see 100%. So there you can pull out where the different crop inputs or farm operations, or even case, which is negligible, what that does for playing a role in those different areas. Interesting enough, farm operations do play a huge role in all of the areas, as well as the crop inputs. Grain drying and storage, not so much, but still a factor in regards to whether you're drying using likely aeration in most cases, but again, it does increase your environmental impact. Moving on, we can see here in this pie chart the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions from the crop inputs. So here, seed is actually quite high in regards to its relative impact. So when you are using higher seeding rates, 180 pounds was the average in this case, it does represent 40%. The largest though, of course, is the big yellow, which is your P2O5 fertilizer, and that's for the production of that fertilizer. You can see inoculant, not a big issue, even at low rates though, for 0.7 pounds per acre, there was still a 3% contribution. Desiccants at 6, fungicide at 1, and again, some of your S and K fertilizer, which are fairly negligible. And N fertilizer, which is always a carrier in 1151, 1155, or however you're getting your fertilizer, your phosphorus, again, you do have some N fertilizer in there as well, but it was fairly negligible. So we're going to move on, but there you get a relative idea of crop inputs. Seed and P2O5 fertilizer are the largest two for greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I wanted to cover off a few other LCAs, or greenhouse gas emissions of peas, and 198 kilograms of CO2e, and that is what our relative GHG emission is. That doesn't include all the other areas of eutrophication, that smog, etc. But you can see for the greenhouse gas warming potential that the Alberta came in just under 0.2, and that orange dotted dashed line here running vertically, you can see is where our LCA greenhouse gas results came in. Now you'll also see here these three bars represent the different soil zones in Western Canada, and this was from a greenhouse gas study back in 2011. And you can see we're actually quite close. We lie kind of in the middle of the three different soil zones that were studied in regards to greenhouse gas emissions. So very close to the 2011, and of course we have an aggregate of 5 different soil zones, or 5 soils that we were looking at. So we are fairly confident that we were in that right in the ballpark. You'll also see here that there's some other areas, New South Wales, Australia in 2015, slightly higher, almost at 0.3 kilograms of CO2e. You can also see Australia did an agri-footprint, so this is through some of the LCA records as well. And you can see where we line up with other peas. So, Czech, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, Romania, Sweden have all gone through a similar process with LCA. And you can see that in the case of our most recent findings, as well as those in 2011, Western Canadian production and Alberta field pea production scores very favorably in regards to their greenhouse gas emissions. When we end, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to flip back to some of these graphs as well. Another thing when looking at an environmental product declaration is we can actually do a comparison in regards to servings of different protein sources. So these two pie charts, the first one represents 1 serving. So that would be 18 grams of protein of peas, and looking at 18 grams of protein of pork or beef or chicken, fish, eggs. And you can see the relative, impact on CO2e. Again, this is global warming potential based on that 1 serving. And you can see the small yellow here represents the environmental impact that field peas, in regards to 1 serving of protein, the relative amount compared to beef, again, pork, chicken, fish, and eggs. So one way to display the relative performance. Now here you're looking at calories rather than necessarily protein, and you can see from the calories, again, 260 calories in that same serving versus 137 for beef, and your other comparisons. So you actually do get a lot more calorie, nutrition, etc. When looking at field peas. So now we'll actually get into some of those producers' data that we had here, and we're going to spend a little bit of time here. The left axis represents yield in bushels per acre, and of course the right axis represents kilograms of P2O5 per acre. So that's how many pounds or kilograms of fertilizer, specifically P2O5 per acre, as it is the largest contributor from the crop input perspective. Now I'll show you this orange graph here represents just that, where we did have the highest rate of applied P2O5 runs up here almost at 120 or just over 120 kilograms per acre, and the lowest being down here for just around that 15, 18 or somewhere in there for P2OE or P2O5 rather. The average application rate again was 35 kilograms of P2O5 per acre, which would put us right here on the red line, and our average yield at 45 bushels per acre. But you can see the variability even with the producers that we had. So I'll point to a couple. Producer 8 and producer 18 were definitely bringing down the average, so to speak, with yields of less than 10 bushels per acre, 8 bushels in this case. And you can see that this data set here, where they didn't reach the average application rate of 35 kilograms, and they weren't anywhere close to average yield. So it would be this producer that likely suffered either drought, or it could have been excess flooding, moisture, who knows what the yield shortfall was or the reason for it. This producer as well, but definitely not a great year for that producer. I'm sure they were even more upset than perhaps I was with them bringing down our average. However, when you look up here, we do have some producers that have done extremely well. Some of them I'll point out is this producer achieving 85 bushels per acre. And you can see, even though they were above the average application rate of phosphorus, they achieved phenomenal yields. You'll see others as well, like this producer who was way below the average for P2O5 per acre, but yet achieved phenomenal yields up near almost that 70 bushel an acre mark. So these, if you were to look at individual producers, would likely have the best environmental performance. So not surprising that we see some of this information and variability within our producers. And again, whether or not you've applied your P2OE here and you don't get the yield, that input is a sunk cost. Once you've put fertilizer in the ground and you've done those field applications, you've spent your fuel and your tractor, there's no getting it back. And it's the same with the atmosphere. Unless it results in a high yield, you could have a very poor environmental performance. So it is related to the amount of applied, your seeding rate, of course, as well, but also looking at how your yield does in the end. So I do want to bring in some of the analysis we did here, and this is in regards to tillage. So you have yellow, which represents conservation tillage. You have your red, which is conventional, and then you have conservation tillage with soil carbon. So this would be in different soil zones. But in all cases, you can see that conservation tillage much outperforms conventional tillage. And again, that's related to the fuel use. So that will show up most here in your global warming potential, but also in some of your acidification and smog. In eutrophication of soils, not a huge correlation there, whether you're are strict conservation tillage or you are doing tillage, not a huge impact on eutrophication, yet there is some. So it just allows us to look at different production systems, field operations, and how that may impact our environmental footprint into the future. So we also looked at some other sensitivity analysis in doubling, tripling our yield, doubling, tripling, quadrupling our fertilizer rates. And we played with the numbers to look at how much of an impact that would have with those. And we had some interesting results as well, nothing that you wouldn't logically expect. But some of the results were a little bit messy, and I didn't want to get into it too much, but I will entertain some questions there as well. Our key findings, though, in this were that the Alberta Field P contributed to lower carbon footprint compared to other studies, because we typically do get higher yields and we have lower fertilizer application rates. In some instances, we know that producers are actually loading up their phosphorus levels in soils in the year they grow peas, because sometimes when you're following peas with wheat or canola, they are high phosphorus users as well. And looking at perhaps getting some of that phosphorus down with your peas the year prior, and loading of your soils for the crops that you will be seeding afterwards, where you may not have the ability to hit all the fertilizer requirements that you would need in row or with the seed, etc. So we know that that happens, and again, we know that with lower fertilizer application rates and higher yields, we have outperformed other jurisdictions in the world that have done LCAs. Again, our crop inputs and farm operations were the environmental hotspots of Alberta field pea production. So those include tillage, number of passes, whether it's conservation or conventional tillage, but also looking at your fertilizer rates, specifically the phosphorus fertilizer. Again, peas, pulses in general are great nitrogen fixers, at least peas and lentils, faba beans as well. And so again, we have that added pulse advantage because they do fix atmospheric nitrogen. Again, no-till systems and efficient fertilizer management are BMPs, and they do reduce the environmental impact of field pea production. So if you are a producer and you're looking at saving money, perhaps you don't have the capital investment into a drill that can do everything in one pass, but we know that environment and economics go hand in hand. What makes environmental sense usually means you're saving a dime and makes economic sense as well. And again, we saw that when we increased crop yield with the same phosphorus levels, that we had reduced environmental impact. And all of our sensitivity analysis would lead us to believe that's the case, and logically it also makes sense. So if you do get that bumper yield and everything lines up, it's likely that you have a much less deleterious or detrimental effect on the environment. So no surprise there. So this is what the Alberta Environmental Product Declaration looks like. Basically, it's on the website envirodec.com. You can search for Alberta peas and it'll pop up. And it sits there, and you can download the entire PDF. And this is the image that was chosen to be put there, and you can see some of the information there as well. And so I'm going to recap a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for some questions. So just to go back, environmental product declarations are useful to resolve unverified, misleading, selective, uncomparable, and sometimes even incomprehensible environmental claims. I know I saw a granola bar on a flight the other day, and I believe there was 7 or 8 different environmental, nutritional claims, etc., that were on the wrapper, the bar, and I had, as a consumer myself, I was confused as to which claim does represent a true claim and which one are unverified, unaudited, or so forth. And environmental product declarations are built upon life cycle analysis, and the genesis was the construction material industry, basically using standardized methodologies that were verified and comparable. So it's stemmed out of construction industries and then very much moved into other industries like textiles and fabrics and blue jeans, and now we're well into food products. And again, this is an area where a lot of major international companies and retailers are looking at what and where in their supply chain they can reduce the environmental impact, etc. So one other thing to remind everyone is that these are only a snapshot in time. They're only as good as your data, and they need continual maintenance. And the one great thing about it is now we have this EPD. It represents a decent baseline that we can start with. And you'll note here that we have an issue date. We were granted in February, I guess, of this year, our environmental product declaration, but it's only valid until 2021. If we were to continue to be listed as having completed the LCA and all the other product category rules, verified, etc., we would have to go back and do this to be on record as having done that continual maintenance, etc. So I want to talk a little bit about the companies that are very much invested in this type of, I guess, certification throughout their supply chains. So Barilla is really one of those companies that's been leading in this regard. And here you can see how they've used some of this information. You'll note here that they have a couple different logos. Of course, their Barilla logo, but here you'll see the environmental product declaration sign that's being used. Sometimes it'll be on the back of the package, but yes, you can see it here, 5 kg. Up in here is the amount of the package, but I believe they will put on the back as well what the footprint is. And you can see here that they were one of the first EPD process certified in the food industry, which they are proud to talk about, and they should be. You can also see Barilla has done a lot of other things. Some of you may or may not be familiar with their foundation, but they look at the environmental pyramid and the food pyramid and how that relates to your overall performance. And they talk about this in regards to their carbon footprint and pyramids, and they basically added up their different products. And eating along certain edges or certain sides of that pyramid will ensure that you're doing your best to limit the impact on your environment. So just another way of how Barilla is using some of this information to communicate to their consumers. You can see another interesting way that all this information is laid out. So this is Durham wheat semolina. Could have likely have been grown in the prairies, who knows? But they do go through and they list all the water consumption, all of the impact indicators that we spoke about as well. They also have some of their other downstream distribution, packaging, end life, etc., that you'll see down here, which is absent from the Alberta Field Pea. And you can see how they're relaying some of this information to their consumers who are interested in knowing what the environmental impact is of their food choices. So I have up here a little bit of information from the European Commission that talks about the environment. And here they're even, mentioning the issue of environmental footprint of products. Many of you have heard of perhaps bilan carbone, which is another French type of footprinting, different standards, I suppose, but they do go through and they list what is being done here in the European Union in that regard, and they are definitely leaders in this field. However, it's not just Barilla, it's not just Danone. Although the two, Barilla and Danone, own by far the majority of environmental product declarations, there are other companies that are definitely working in this area. And you can see from beer to coffee to olive oil, seafood, even packaged water, right? So you see Nestle, you see a lot of companies that you'll recognize as well, some that you probably have never heard of. Anheuser-Busch, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of producers who are listening in today that probably heard of that. Carlsberg as well in this industry. So you can see a lot of companies are interested in this space, and they are working on having EPDs done for some of their where they're sourcing their ingredients from, etc., so that they can account for all of the emissions as well as the other environmental impacts that their supply chains and products have on their consumers. So again, this is what the Alberta Field Pea Environmental Product Declaration looks like. I would encourage everyone to hop on environdec.com and check it out. It was for a while there right on the front page saying new Alberta Environmental Product Declaration for field peas. However, there's been quite a few more products since then, and we've been bumped down the list a little bit. So you will need to search for Alberta peas. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about who was working on this project. And again, this was a collaboration between Alberta Ag and Forestry staff, as well as some of the staff here at Alberta Pulse Growers. And again, this opportunity was afforded by a grant from GF2 programming as well. And we definitely need to give a shout out to Ung Mo, who ran all of the SimaPro software and was really the workhorse behind getting the LCA done. Again, a lot of other staff within the sustainability division over at A&F, including Carrie Ann, Len, Roger, Tom, and Mark, that all participated along the way, provided input, helped build surveys, etc. And we couldn't have done it without that support and collaboration. So now I wanted to get into a time where I'd like to open it up for any questions that anyone has, and I'll do to the best of my ability to try to answer it 100%. So for that, I thank you for your patience, and I would love to entertain questions.
Thank you, Nevin. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one is, now that Alberta Pulse has a designation, what is the next step for the sector?
Great question. So what is the next step for the sector? So we've already been working on this a little bit, but the next step for Alberta Pulse Growers is to communicate with our members that this has been done, but also to our potential buyers. This includes our brokers that may or may not be familiar with EPDs that are local and regional, but also looking at some of those end users. So interesting enough, we have been in communication with Barilla already. Maybe it was that tweet I put out tagging them in it on Twitter, but we have been chatting with them, and they've been open to discuss why they use these EPDs as well. Other companies, we're going to be reaching out that do source a lot of Alberta field peas, and just let them know that we've gone through these steps. And again, this is a baseline, it's a starting point, and as I mentioned before, it will require maintenance. However, when we go to do that, and I'll say that'll be step 2, is out to 2020, is we will have to go back and survey producers, but some of the base information, such as whether or not your bins have wood floors versus concrete floors, shop dimensions, usage of natural gas for the whole farm versus the yard, and then splitting that out across the crops. That background information still sits there, and unless there's huge changes to yards and farms, we won't need to survey that many producers on all of those questions. So we'll likely be able to have a shorter survey that covers those main inputs, those core areas, and yeah, it could be a next step is to update this out to 2020. And again, we'd love to have a much greater survey participation.
Okay. In the second question, I think kind of relates to what you just mentioned, but do you see LCA and EPDs as a long-term sustainability communication for your industry to keep marketing their environmental performance and products, or do you think that'll change over time?
I do think that it will be a longer term type of process. Again, we're still, even though that first LCA was done back in 1969 with Coca-Cola, we've really only touched the tip of the iceberg right now. As I mentioned, there's 132 different food products that have gone through this certification and are in the system. Certainly in my diet, I would hope I eat more than 132 different products, but there's certainly a lot more out there that need to be done. For the pulse industry, as we do have nitrogen fixation, that amazing symbiotic process between rhizobium bacteria and pulse plants or legumes, because we can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, that does give the pulse industry a very good news story in regards to our relative environmental impact compared to other crops, say. Again, though, this is a cropping system, so it's good for those producers who are growing peas to know that this is a huge savings for fertilizer, right? Your fertilizer bill, but also that it has less of an impact. And we would never propose any type of monoculture cropping system to lower your environmental impact because we know that crop rotation is key to weed, disease, insect control, etc. But I do believe that this is just the beginning. I think that we will see LCAs done in other products, maybe even though that second and third step to go on to have environmental product declarations.
Okay. So when you going through the presentation, you mentioned that there was 23 producers that participated with your initial survey. Do you have any advice to help others thinking about going through the process, or how do we engage and get support from more producers on that piece?
Right, and that's a challenge. To have had 25 producers attempt, or 26, and 23 completed surveys, of course, as staff members, as busy bees behind the scenes, we would have loved to have had a higher participation. The problem is to find producers that are willing to give up 3 hours of their day, in this case for our original survey. Some producers could do it quicker if they had all their documentation and records in front of them. But to take that time to sit down to do something that benefits the entire industry is, it's 3 hours of your time in a day where there's hardly enough hours to get everything else off of your plate. So it is a huge ask of producers and members to go through this. There are ways to grab other data sets that exist out there. And in fact, we used data from different locations to just look at how that would impact the sensitivity, et cetera. And so my suggestion would be that if there are other commodity groups that are looking at going through this process and trying to achieve an environmental product declaration claim, that the survey is probably the hardest step in setting that up, so that it's all encompassing, that you have all the questions there that are needed in order to complete the LCA, but also those product category rules. It really needs to be well thought out, and it's not a short process either. All right, this was initiated back in 2015, and again, it took almost 3 full years to achieve that EPD in February of this year.
So from a producer perspective, if I'm, as a producer, asked to complete that, what's in it for me as the producer? I know it
so
helps
as an individual producer,
yeah.
Right. Yeah, for an individual producer, you're not going to see an immediate type of return, but industry-wide, absolutely, it definitely gives us that baseline, a starting point. It's allowed us to look at how we can change our agronomic recommendations for phosphorus fertilization, et cetera. And as well, we know what additional passes in the field do in regards to your environmental performance, so to speak. We also know that it costs you money. And I think that's where producers, even knowing that there's other producers out there that are using conservation tillage or direct seeding, zero till to seed peas, and that they are getting fantastic yields or amazing results. So for what's in it for the producer, it all comes down to other areas of where you have industry goods or public goods, right? So we have a lot of areas where, as producers, ensuring that we have, clean samples, limited dockage, making sure we don't have noxious weeds, does the entire industry good. But, going through some of these surveys, et cetera, although it might not be your cup of tea, from an industry perspective, it has done us a lot of good.
Okay. Yeah, and I think there's some tie into the learnings and pulling that out and showing them the benefits of different practices too, sharing information on different practices.
Absolutely. From a staff perspective, absolutely.
Okay. So now that you've done the field P side of it, do you see it working on any other pulses?
Good question. Something that we haven't actually approached our board of directors to discuss, but it is an interesting question. And I think, in regards to where we're positioned, Alberta versus the rest of the prairies, Alberta does produce and export more yellow peas than any other pulse crop. So, yellow peas are really our baby, and that's where we started. Other crops that would be very interesting would be, of course, faba beans and lentils, but also some of our dry bean growers down in southern Alberta under irrigation. If I was, and you did ask me which pulse would be next, I would say perhaps we would have a keen interest in looking at some of our dry bean production down in southern Alberta. Again, it introduces irrigation, which is another factor. So it would be, from my opinion, a really interesting one to look at. So that's where I would be suggesting our board look at doing our next step if we do proceed to do another pulse. But again, that's not for.
Okay, you just kind of cut out there.
Sorry.
That's all right. So do you see the EPD helping you with your government relations in relation to carbon management?
Great question, and I would say absolutely. The more we find out, and the more data and documentation we have to support the fact that Alberta field peas and other pulses can reduce your overall climatic impact, environmental impact, all the better, right? And we at Alberta Pulse Growers have been advocating for farmers to add pulses to their rotation for just that. The soil benefits, all of the co-benefits, not just greenhouse gas related to nitrogen fertilizer, but to everything else that comes along with including pulses in your rotation. So I do believe that, going forward in our communications with government, as well as with international customers, or even, traditional, say, grain millers that are looking at including pulses, so pulse inclusion into fractions of flour, et cetera, and how that will result in a lower environmental footprint for, say, even a breakfast cereal. So these are ways that we intend on using this EPD to communicate to, yes, levels of government, but also to ultimately those end users, processors, ingredient suppliers, and manufacturers on, this good news story of Alberta field peas and the very low environmental product footprint that we have achieved with them.
Okay. So, next question from Carrie here is from Carrie Ann. Are your growers using environmental footprint calculators, and does Alberta Pulse endorse any specific tool?
Another good question from Carrie Ann. So yes, our producers are using other tools that relate to environment, to sustainability as well. Environmental footprint calculator is another tool that is used in Western Canada, but also in the United States. A close colleague of ours, Dennis Tremorin, as well as consultants, have been working on that project for quite a while. And that looks at more of a systems-based perspective, a cropping system, including canola, wheat, barley, and other crops in rotation. So it's probably the next step, even a more holistic view. Other tools, of course, Alberta Pulse Growers has been working with our sister commissions at Alberta Canola, Alberta Wheat, Alberta Barley, and we've just come out with a new sustainability tool as well that is above and beyond the environmental farm plan in some aspects, because it covers some of the social and economic indicators that are used. And this relates to different sustainable sourcing platforms or schemes, programs that exist around the world. So that's another tool that relates to sustainability, et cetera. And that's more of a producer-focused tool rather than a marketing or a, I guess, environmental awareness tool like the EPD in this case. So yeah, there's a number of tools that are out there that can help producers look at how they can reduce their environmental footprint, so to speak, and ensure that they can pass that farm on to the next generation. And the EPD in a way is a tool for agronomists and staff at A&F, myself included, to go back and look at some of these hot spots in production and to make different types of recommendations, I suppose. The other tools, again, would be more focused towards producers. And yes, there are quite a few different tools on our website. Again, the most recent one would be farmsustainability.com. And we've just recently announced that tool and have launched it. So there is definitely more information on our website, as well as Alberta Canola, Alberta Wheat, and Alberta Barley's website for that tool.
Yes, and we did do a webinar on that tool. If people are interested, it is posted on the website and gives a little bit more detail on how it works. So I think this may be the last question here, and it just goes back to the market access. And I know you talked about talking to Barilla and their use of EPD and possible markets there. Has it increased your market share anywhere else, maybe in terms of international trade in that, or other ways that that's going to impact your direct ways that will impact your market?
Right. So has it yet to increase our market share in certain markets? There would be no way to know as of yet. This is just new, fresh off the press as of February. We haven't necessarily been communicating it as loud as we can as of yet. This is kind of our second or third crack at the can at getting out awareness. But yes, it will definitely help in certain instances with those ingredient manufacturers. A lot of the large, the Mars, the Nestle's, the Barillas, the Unilevers of the world, even Walmart, Carrefour, Tesco, some of the large retailers, they are all looking at their supply chain they're looking at this new triple bottom line with being socially responsible and making sure, that they're not, they have an environmental component as well to their metrics of measurement of success, et cetera. So there's many large companies that are looking at their entire supply chain. They're looking at where they can eliminate some of the largest contributing factors to the environmental degradation, et cetera, to ensure that they can meet what their buyers, their consumers are demanding. And that is that they know what the impact is. And in certain instances in packaging industries, they can make huge strides in very short time. So absolutely, I think in the future, having completed an environmental product declaration will allow us to gain access into some of those markets that can command premiums at time. But also, I think that there's also an issue of retaining market access. I think in the future, as we see more EPDs come out, more life cycle assessments or analysis is done and completed on certain types of commodities like peas and wheat and barley, canola, et cetera, that Canada may have to ensure that we've completed some of these so that we aren't shut out of market access. So some of these suppliers will, in my opinion, in the future be asking for what is the environmental impact of your specific product that you're selling. So as of today, we can't measure in any way that we've increased our market share, but we definitely can see that this being used as a tool in the future to do that.
Well, thank you. That is, I believe, our last question that we have. I thank you very much for your presentation, Nevin. It was very interesting. It's really interesting to see how we're bringing together all our tools and our science knowledge to help kind of quantify our environmental impact. It's something that we've been working on for many, many years, but to actually see pieces like this put together is really satisfying and great to see that linkage back to how do we use that for within our markets.
Right.
So this presentation will be recorded once again. It will be posted on our webpage. If you go to Agriculture and Forestry's webpage and search for sustainability, you will find the site, and you can listen to it again or pass it on to your coworkers that would be interested in it. And once again, thank you, Nevin, for the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much again for the opportunity. And again, thanks to all the colleagues at Alberta Pulse, but also at Alberta Ag and Forestry, who did a lot of work in the backgrounds on this project. So thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. We'll now end the session.